I am Evelyn Cole, 38, and on Christmas night in Charleston, my own brother told me to wait in the car while he tried to impress investors. I walked into Indigo House anyway, sat down at my family's table, and 15 minutes later, the CEO everyone was courting walked in, saw me, and bowed. Madam President. The room went still, and I had to decide whether to swallow the insult or let the truth speak for itself. If your family tried to seat you outside, would you stay quiet or claim your chair? Stay with me because in the next few minutes, I will show how one calm folder and one choice changed that table and everything that followed. The wreaths on the mahogany door smelled like cedar and oranges when I stepped out of the cold and into the private dining room at Indigo House. Carolers drifted somewhere in the lobby, soft as a lullaby. My navy coat fell to my shoulders, and the deep blue dress I had chosen for tonight caught the light like quiet water. I had not been back to Charleston in years. The room felt small and bright and full of eyes. Drew stood between me and the table as if he were a doorman for a life that no longer fit me. He had that polished suit in charcoal and the look he saved for mirrors and photographers. He lifted his chin and told me to wait in the car and said, "We need these investors." Every head at the table turned, then looked down, a little flutter of cloth napkins and wine stems. I felt the old heat climb my throat, but I kept my voice inside. I was not here to fight in a dining room. I was here to sit at the table I had earned. Margaret pressed her hand flat on the table as if to keep the plates from moving. Lawrence stared at the candle flame and tightened his fingers around the stem of his glass. A server hovered with a silver tray, then backed away like a tide. I stood still, feet planted, the coat warm on my shoulders. I could feel the weight of every December I had missed and every word I had swallowed. I breathed once. I breathed again. I did not step aside. 15 minutes later, the door opened, and a hush moved through the room as if someone had drawn a curtain across the noise. Victor Lang, the CEO, came in with winter on his coat, that expensive quiet some men wear like a ring. He was scanning the table when he saw me. He stopped. He inclined his head in a small bow that carried more meaning than any toast. He addressed me as Madam President and said he did not know this was my family. The room froze. I heard a fork touch a plate, and then nothing at all. My brother pulled at his cuff like it was choking him. The server swallowed and stared at the floor. The candles hummed. It was the softest music I had ever heard. Victor stepped closer, and the light caught the corner of his smile. "Good to see you, boss," he said in a voice meant for only me. I watched the color drain from Drew's face. He shifted his stance and then found nowhere to put his hands. Margaret's practiced smile went stiff and fragile. Lawrence set his glass down very carefully, as if glass had learned to bruise. I walked past my brother and the empty chair at the head of the table, waited as if it had always known my name. I did not rush. I felt the fabric of the deep blue dress move against my knees and the floorboards take my weight. I pulled the chair out. I sat. The linen napkin was cool against my palm. I smoothed it over my lap and lifted my gaze to the people who had raised me, doubted me, loved me in their uneven ways. Drew looked at the investors on his left, as if one of them could lend him a new story to stand in. No one spoke. The carols from the lobby slipped through the doorway again and found the quiet corners. Margaret touched the pearl at her ear, and then her hand fell away. Lawrence let out a breath he had been holding since summer. I kept my posture easy and my voice still inside my chest. There would be a time for explanations. There would be a place for documents and decisions. Not here. Not over a table set with winter flowers and family china that had survived more storms than we could count. The server returned braver now and placed a basket of warm rolls near my hand. Steam rose like a prayer. I nodded, and he nodded back. It was the smallest exchange, and yet it reset the room by a fraction. I reached for the water glass and felt the ring of condensation cool my fingers. I let the quiet do its work. Respect is louder when you do not shout for it. Victor took his seat beside the investors and folded his coat over the back of his chair. He did not steal the moment. And he did not feed it either. He simply allowed it to be exactly what it was. A truth spoken without a single raised voice. Drew cleared his throat. He said the words, "We can start now," and his voice wavered on the last word. No one moved. No one. My mother lifted her eyes to mine, and for a heartbeat, I saw the girl she used to be before the town had taught her to care more about whispers than about grace. She gave the smallest nod. It was not surrender. It was something closer to permission to let the night be salvaged. I rested my hands on the table that had once been a stage for my humiliation. It felt different under my palms. Solid, honest. I could feel the room recalibrate around the simple fact of where I sat. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I let the candles burn and the carols drift and the plates remain exactly where they were. I had come to eat with my family. I had come to be seen. I had come to make sure that no one left this room believing I belonged out in the cold. I let my hands settle on the linen for one more breath, then drew the leather folder from my bag and set it at the center of the table. The act was simple, and it changed the temperature of the room by a few honest degrees. I said that Langridge is a private company. I serve as board president at Langridge. The board voted last week, and that every step required for this partnership was completed last week. Council reviewed the board, voted filings were made. Tonight is a courtesy. Faces to names. No decisions left, hanging on a holiday. Eyes moved to Victor. He confirmed in that steady way of his that the board actions were final and that the documents inside the folder matched what had already been executed. He added that holiday timing does not weaken enforceability and that any signatures requested tonight are acknowledgments for the record, not conditions to close. The investors relaxed in the small ways people in finance do. A napkin flattened. A glass set down evenly. The tiniest click of a pen cap left on the table instead of in a hand. Margaret watched Victor speak and then watched me as if following the order could teach her something new about the story she was in. Lawrence gave the brief nod he saves for trains that arrive on schedule. My brother Drew shifted his weight and kept his hands where everyone could see them. He understood that the folder did not ask for permission. It proved that permission had already been granted in rooms that do not serve dessert. I kept to the calendar. The first working session will be the morning of December 26th at Langridge Tower. Security badges will be ready at the front desk, and a short agenda will be waiting in the conference room. I noted that the building has announced a rename to Cole Innovation Center, effective at the new year, and that signage will follow in January. For us, the work begins the minute we sit down after the holiday. Responsibilities remain as briefed. Access remains controlled. I opened the folder just enough to show the tabs without turning dinner into a seminar. Approvals. Consents. A closing checklist with most lines marked complete. The remaining items were administrative already scheduled. Victor confirmed again that conditions precedent had been satisfied the prior week. He assured the man to his left that headlines would not alter capital structure or control. The man nodded, relieved by the vocabulary of certainty. I told my family what the first session would cover. Current operations. Immediate risk. A path to modernize where we lagged. Natalie will join for the operational pass-down. Eleanor will chair the legal review. Maya will coordinate materials and access so no one fumbles for a file while a clock is running. Ethan will come in for the river and flood overlays in the afternoon if needed. By lunch, we will know which pieces need grease and which need new parts. I wrote the time on the back of a place card so even the paper loyalists would have something to pin to the refrigerator. 9:30. Check-in 10 start. I set the card at the edge of the folder and left it there. No one argued the hour. Investors live by calendars. So do I. So will we. That was the business. I closed the folder and slipped it back into my bag. I thanked Victor and our guests for their time and said the formal portion of the evening was complete. The rest of the night belonged to winter plates and quiet talk. No more introductions to the project. No more questions to pin anyone to a wall. Supper could remember that it was supper. The server stepped in with new water and a basket of warm rolls that steamed gently when he lifted the linen. He placed butter that was soft enough to spread without scarring the bread. Someone laughed at a small remark about the weather. The carols in the lobby drifted in again and did not need to do any heavy lifting. Margaret lowered her shoulders by a fraction and let the rhythm of passing plates do the talking for her. Lawrence rested his napkin on his lap with the care he gives to rituals that have outlived pride. Drew pulled out his chair and sat. It reads like a sentence with subject and verb and a clean period. He did not look for applause from the investors or rescue from me. He let the room be ordinary. For once, ordinary was the right size. I tasted the bread and let the heat rest in my palm a moment longer than necessary. The folder was where it belonged. The date was set. The work would meet us under fluorescent lights that do not care about anyone's feelings. I looked around the table and decided to let the rest of this meal be exactly what it was trying to be, a family sharing food, without the smoke of rumor between courses. We asked about travel. We noted the forecast. We spoke of the river and the way Charleston keeps Christmas in the air a little longer than the calendar would suggest. When the plates were cleared, I asked for coffee for the table and water for me. The candles kept humming. The night kept its dignity. The next step would not require music or ceremony. It would require showing up on the morning we had named. The night finished itself without fanfare, and the city breathed in the cold. I drove home through streets that knew my childhood and my absences, then slept the clean sleep that follows a choice made out loud. In the morning, I opened the door to the office where my real life had been built one plain day at a time. North Star Meridian did not start with a ribbon or applause. It began in a room with thin carpet and a window that faced a parking lot. I made coffee in a dented machine and wrote my list in blue ink. I told myself that discipline could be a kind of love when the world is not generous with the other kinds. I learned the sound a fluorescent bulb makes when it decides to keep going. I learned that you can walk out the same door every evening and still feel like you are moving forward. At sunrise, I took the path along the water and let the marsh air clear the leftover noise from other people's expectations. By noon, I ate a simple lunch at my desk and answered the emails that build tomorrow's bones. At night, I wrote the next day's list so fear had less to say while I slept. Maya arrived first and turned chaos into something you could stack on a shelf. She treated sensitive files like living things that need air and boundaries. She locked what must be locked and still found a way to make the work feel human. She told me in her steady way that careful is not the same as afraid and that we would not confuse the two. I believed her because she never reached for drama when a checklist would do. Ethan took a seat with a laptop that could light a quiet room. He mapped river edges and low streets and the reaches of tide the way a person might map a childhood neighborhood. He built layers that show how water wants to move and where people insist on living. He said if we plan for water, we plan for people, and my shoulders eased in a way I had not expected. With him, risk turned from a rumor into a map you could touch with your finger. Eleanor joined like a front of clear weather. She arrived with a folder and a face that asked a room to lower its voice. She read contracts as if the future were hiding between two ordinary words, and all you had to do was refuse to hurry. She asked questions that keep ambition from wobbling. She was not impressed by speed. She was impressed by the order that produces results in daylight. I learned to value the kind of sentence that stands up later when a stranger reads it with a cool eye. We stayed late more nights than I can count. The building emptied and the vents hummed like a low lullaby. Maya would call goodnight from the copy room, and Ethan would send a fresh map layer that turned a maybe into a yes. I would check one more clause so that I could sleep with a different kind of quiet. The office windows held our reflections and reminded me that progress can look like a few small lights left on after everyone else has gone home. Before the holiday break, the building was half asleep. Downstairs, the lobby tree glowed in patient white, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon from a bowl of wrapped candies the guard kept by his desk. I wore a plain sweater and flats, because long days do not reward vanity. We gathered in the smaller conference room where the glass does not invite a view, and that was perfect. This was work you do with your head down. Maya had the permissions list open and checked. She nodded once and slipped out to hold the door against interruptions. Ethan sent a message from his desk that the flood overlays were posted to the secure drive and the backup had been tested. The maps would be waiting when the city asked its next hard question. Eleanor set a neat stack of documents before me and placed her pen beside the top page. She did not fill the air. She let the room be as quiet as it needed to be for a decision to land. I read every line. Not because I doubted the work, but because reading is how I slow my heart to the truth. Care, duty, scope. Words that look simple until you promise them with your name. I signed the first page, and then the next. I did not think of who would scoff or who would clap. I thought of the morning I had driven over the bridge with everything I owned in the trunk and told myself I would only come back when I could stand upright. When I raised my head, Eleanor was watching with that small private smile that asks for nothing in return. She slid the last page toward me and placed one finger on the line. I wrote my name and the air in the room shifted by a degree you can only measure from the inside. She closed the folder and reached her hand across the table. I met it. Her grip was dry and warm and certain. She said I was ready. The words did not need volume. They had weight. We sat for a moment without speaking. A building settles at a certain hour and makes the kinds of sounds you only hear when you are paying attention. I let the pen rest near my hand and thought of chairs at tables I had once been told were not mine. I thought of the way a door can look locked until you decide to pull instead of push. I stood and stepped into the hallway. The afternoon light had turned the end pane of glass into a mirror. I walked toward it and let my reflection come into focus. The sweater plain. The hair pulled back. The face I have carried through rooms that did not want my voice and rooms that did not know they needed it. I did not practice smiling. I did not rehearse a speech. I looked at myself and recognized the person who chooses her seat and then earns it. In the lobby, the guard lifted a hand, and I lifted mine. The tree lights blinked a slow code that felt like patience. Outside, the air held that clean winter promise that tomorrow will not pretend to be anything other than work. I stepped into it and did not hurry. There was a morning on a calendar with my name on it and a room where my team would sit on purpose. I had signed what needed signing. I had shaken the hand that matters when you are done asking permission. The rest would be done at a table where paper and daylight tell the same story. The first business morning after Christmas opened gray and clean. Langridge Tower felt half asleep. The lobby tree still lit as if it had one more job to do before the new year. Upstairs, the conference room smelled like coffee and paper. Natalie set a pad at each chair and Maya placed a small stack of pens in the center, as if order could steady the air. I took my seat at the end of the table where the screen was easy to see. We did not waste words. Drew arrived last with rain on his shoulders and a newspaper folded hard enough to crease the headline. He let it fall onto the table. The story had that familiar hunger for drama and certainty. It made me a mask people could point at. It made him a son scrambling to keep a crown in place. Natalie winced. Eleanor slid the paper aside without reading past the first line. She prefers documents that have signatures and dates. I reached for the remote and brought the contract up on the wall. There is a particular quiet a room takes when facts stand taller than feelings. Clause by clause, the language filled the screen. Short-term money at a sharp price. A trigger that could be pulled if the company missed early targets in the thin days after the holiday. The trigger did not care about reputation or intention. It cared about math and time. Eleanor leaned forward and spoke in the way she does when kitchens are better than courtrooms. She said the loan was like borrowing a lifeboat with a rope tied to the keel. It would float if we kept rowing exactly as promised. If we slipped even a little, the lender had the right to climb aboard and steer. She traced the path from now to what the contract allowed in the first 1 week of January. Accounts restricted. Projects paused. 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 1 week Control asserted for the sake of repayment. No villains in the text, only levers. Natalie kept her eyes on Drew. Concern lived on her face without accusation. She asked the question that mattered most in that room. What had pressed him to sign this in the dark of a holiday week? He did not sit. He held the back of his chair like it was a railing on a sharp turn. He said he had been thinking about Christmas dinner and investors and the way our mother reads a room. He said he wanted to look like an heir who knew how to keep the lights on. He admitted that he had been afraid of looking small. He admitted that he had been afraid of me. The words came out flat and true like nails laid on a workbench. I quietly did a little work before I answered. I told him the contract did not care how anyone looked. It cared whether the company met the marks exactly as written. I told the room that we had two roads. We could be transparent and disciplined, speak to the lender with a clean plan, and protect our people while paying what we owed. Or we could let pride keep the wheel until the trigger found our ankle. One path would cost humility and effort. The other would cost far more than reputation. Maya pushed a one-page sheet across the table. Contacts, deadlines, the first steps we would need before lunch if we chose the grown path. She had already checked access permissions and pulled the message templates. She did not offer speeches. She offered lanes to run in. Natalie added that operations could tighten reporting today, so nothing fell between cracks just because the calendar still smelled like pine and cinnamon. Her voice was steady the way water is steady when it is deep. Drew finally sat. It was a small thing, and it felt like the first right verb of the day. He said he would bring every email and every text that touched this loan. He said he would answer without dressing the answers. His eyes did not search for approval and did not flinch from consequence. Some men grow up in a moment you do not see coming. I watched that moment begin. I pointed to the last page on the screen. A list titled, Conditions Already Satisfied. The few remaining items were processed, not power. Eleanor noted that the building had publicly announced a rename to Cole Innovation Center at the turn of the year, and that the contract recognized the entity regardless of the sign on the door. She said the law does not care about banners. It cares about who holds authority on paper. Natalie opened her laptop and typed with that clean economy of motion she has. She flagged the bank contact we would need and drafted a note that spoke like a person and not a press release. Maya confirmed the time slots we could take that afternoon without knocking into other commitments. Ethan sent a short note from his desk that the river overlays were posted and that he would be available if a question about site risk tried to hijack the call. No one reached for drama. We reached for pencils. Drew lifted the newspaper again, folded it until the loud headline disappeared, and set it quietly at the far edge of the table. He said the story in ink did not get to be the story in this room. I found myself willing to meet him in that sentence. Eleanor tapped the screen once with her pen tip. The clause we feared most glowed a little in the projector light. She said the lender would respect adults who show up with real numbers and a plan that fits in a day as well as a month. She said we should call before lunch. I looked around the table and felt the room align. The lobby tree could keep its soft light a little longer. Up here, winter was only a date on a calendar. The work had taken off its coat. We made a short list with real verbs and no adjectives. Then we stood, each person gathering what they needed for the hours between now and the call that would test whether discipline could undo what pride had set in motion. By early afternoon, the building had settled into that winter quiet that makes every door close softer. We took the smaller conference room that faces rooftops and a slice of river. No catering. Water on a tray. Legal pads in a neat row. I set my notes to the side and let the table be bare enough for real work. The clock had the kind of patience that comes after a hard morning. Gabe Rourke from Pinecrest arrived exactly on time. He carried a slim notebook and the practiced ease of someone who has spent years in rooms where money and nerves share the same chair. We shook hands as people who prefer straight lines. He took the seat across from me. Eleanor settled to my left with her folder ready. Natalie sat to my right with a short stack of operational summaries. Maya took the end of the table where she could reach the printer and the door. Drew sat beside her with the file on the loan he had signed in the heat of image management. I opened with the truth kept simple. The loan had bought days at a price that would be foolish to keep paying now that we had a plan. We were prepared to tighten operations report clearly and keep our promises in writing and in practice. In return, we asked Pinecrest to sell the position back at a fair number given the risks we had already reduced, and to allow an interest schedule that acknowledged a business run by grown people rather than by fear. I did not color the sentences. I let them stand like bricks. Gabe listened without tapping his pen. He asked Drew to explain why the loan had been taken in the first place. Drew did not reach for a speech. He said the image had pushed him into a corner. He said he had been worrying about what people would say at a holiday table instead of what the math would do in January. He kept his eyes on the paper. He did not ask to be spared. Gabe nodded once the way a man nods when he recognizes a mistake he has seen before and made himself in another decade. Eleanor walked through the steps we would take between this hour and the end of the week. Daily internal reporting with a second set of eyes on any change that could shift cash in a dangerous direction. Covenants translated into plain sentences so that the team could follow them without a lawyer at their elbow. A promise that any deviation would be reported the same day with a path back to compliance written in the same breath as the admission. She avoided flourish and kept her words at kitchen table height. Natalie laid out the operational fixes already in motion. Intake reviewed by a human before files moved forward. A 2-layer check on identity and address so small errors did not turn into large delays. End-of-day reconciliations posted to a board everyone could see. She owned each line with the calm of someone who has already done the work in her head before speaking it out loud. Gabe watched her and then looked back at me. I could see his posture ease by a degree that only long practice can measure. Maya confirmed that underlying consents had been filed, and that any assignment could be processed with no friction on our side. She had the routing details printed and clipped. She had a checklist with boxes ready to be filled in ink, not hope. She placed it near Gabe so he could see that the ceremony had no place at our table. Gabe asked for our number and for what we would accept on the interest line if Pinecrest sold. I gave him the figure and the reasoning. It was not a bargain built on charm. It was a price built on the change in risk now that chaos had been replaced by process. Eleanor added that we were not asking for favors. We were asking to buy back pressure so that the business could breathe and pay everyone owed on time and in full. Silence came, then the good kind that gives a proposal room to stand up on its own legs. Outside, the winter sun pushed through a thin cloud and lit the corner of the table. Gabe closed his notebook and let his hand rest on it. He said Pinecrest had no appetite for running other people's companies. If we could finish papers today and send confirmation from the bank by evening, he would approve an assignment at the number we proposed and step out of the doorway. He expected our noise to stop and our reporting to match the words we had just spoken. The room did not lift so much as a line. Eleanor pulled the draft assignment across the table and began to mark dates and names with the steadiness of a person crossing a street with a child. Maya sent the notice to the bank with the updated wire instructions and waited for the first reply. Natalie updated her list on the wall with a square labeled "Done" for each item as it clicked into place. Drew signed where Eleanor pointed and did not rush his pen. I initiated with the same hand I had used all year to pick my seat and keep it. When we reached the last page, Gabe stood. He offered his hand across the table. The grip was firm without performance. I met it. The moment held just long enough to be real and then moved on. He said his team would send the confirmation note as soon as the bank marked the assignment complete. He thanked us for being direct and walked out with the same quiet he had walked in. We stayed seated for a beat while the air in the room caught up to the paper. Then the chime of an email arrived from down the hall. Maya checked and gave a small nod. First receipt confirmed by the bank. A second mail would follow once the ledger moved. We gathered the signed pages and placed them in an envelope that looked too ordinary to carry the weight it carried. Drew spoke low enough that it almost belonged to the table and not to the room. He said thank you. The words were honest and thin. I told him thanks would belong to the work he did next. I told him thanks were for change, not for rescue. He looked at the checklist Natalie had written in her square, careful hand and said he would start now. By dusk, the city had taken on that soft glow it wears when offices empty and kitchens fill. The second email landed with the 3 words that close a door behind a mistake and open another to steadier ground. Confirmed. Assigned. Effective. I read it once and let my shoulders drop. Natalie exhaled through a smile she did not show and checked the last square. Eleanor capped her pen and set it down like a small ritual. Maya forwarded the packet to the archive and labeled it in a way that would make sense years from now. Drew folded the newspaper that had mocked our chances and placed it in the recycling bin without ceremony. We left the room as the light faded from the river. The hallway felt wider. The elevator seemed to arrive faster. A single lever had been removed from a wall that did not belong in our future. There was more to do, and we knew it, but for that evening the company stood on ground it could keep. The calm from the lender meeting lasted about an hour. Then the building changed pitch the way a room does when someone opens a window you did not know was there. Maya came in with her laptop against her chest, and that careful look that means the news is not finished with us. A new piece had gone live at the Post and Courier under Lydia Hart's name. It dressed the week in bright words and wrong edges. It called me unmasked and painted the last year as a grudge in heels. It treated the process like a conspiracy and skipped the work entirely. By the time I scrolled to the end, the comments had already turned the story into a campfire. Maya sat close and laid out a quiet string of tabs. She had traced a limited access media packet that our PR support had prepared for controlled releases. The log showed a link accessed from a familiar address. It was Tessa. A small bundle of images and talking points had been copied and sent along in a way that looked like a helping hand and behaved like a stone in a pond. I asked Maya to bring Tessa up and asked Eleanor to sit with us. Drew stood by the window and watched the river as if it could tell him a better ending than the one in print. Tessa arrived with her hair pulled back too tight and a brave face that did not last. She sat, folded her fingers in her lap, and waited for me to speak. I kept my voice even. We had identified a leak and the path traced back to her account. I told her that intention does not change the fact. A leak is a leak. Her chin tipped down, and the truth came in a rush. She had wanted to help her cousin look strong. She had thought a little pressure in the press might speed us up or soften me in rooms where I do not bend for theater. She said she had not meant harm. She said she had not understood how fast a small packet can turn into a story with teeth. Eleanor placed both hands flat on the table and spoke in plain language. There was a non-disclosure agreement with real obligations. The right forum to resolve this would be arbitration, so that the work of accountability stayed out of the circus. She would file the demand immediately after the holiday office reopened. We would ask for an expedited schedule. The goal would be repair and deterrence, not spectacle. She looked at Tessa the same way she looks at a tired witness, and waited until Tessa nodded that she understood the words as they were spoken. I set a path on paper. Effective now, a suspension from all project work, mandatory ethics training from an accredited program with weekly check-ins and written reflections. A restitution plan. Consistent with the contract, paid over time in amounts that fit a life but do not let the lesson fade. A bar on any further access to media materials or internal drives until clearance is earned back. A single point of contact, so she is not lost in a maze, and so we are not tugged in 10 directions. Maya already had the suspension notice drafted in clean language without heat. She placed a copy at the corner of the table and another by Eleanor's folder. Natalie stepped in just long enough to set water within reach, and then stepped back out. Drew stayed at the window, head bent the shape of a man staring at the floor of a mistake he had not asked for and still had to help mop. I pulled the chair beside me out by a few inches and asked Tessa to move into it. I wanted her close enough to hear the difference between shame and responsibility. I told her the door back was not closed. It was heavy, and it had hinges that squeaked. If she carried her end of this and did it without apology theater, there would be a way to return to ordinary work. If not, the paper she had signed would do its quiet job. Tessa wiped her face and said she would do the training and the payments and the work. She asked if there was anything she could do now that would matter to someone other than me. Maya suggested a volunteer shift with the neighborhood legal clinic in January, so she could spend time watching what careless sharing can cost people who do not have spare dollars to buy their way out of small disasters. Tessa said she would sign up that night. I believed her because her voice had lost the softness it wears when someone still thinks they can charm the bill collector. Eleanor sent the electronic filing to the arbitration center with the packet of exhibits needed to make sense of what had happened. A confirmation email returned within the hour with a note that scheduling would begin the first week of January. Names of available neutrals. A window of dates. Instructions for exchanging lists. It was the kind of message that lets a room breathe again because the next step has a place to sit. We agreed on a communication line that did not feed the rumor mill. I would handle any press calls. Lydia would be invited to a longer interview after the hearing next week, so she could meet the neighbors she had not quoted and the plans she had waved past. Public corrections were the paper's job, not ours. Our job was to do the work in daylight until the facts made their own noise. Drew finally came back to the table. He told Tessa he would drive her to Margaret's later to explain what she had done and what she had promised to do. He said he would sit there and listen and not let the conversation turn into a performance about his pride. He said he would call Lydia himself and ask her to hear the parts she had missed. It sounded like a plan a man makes when he is learning to be useful. The building settled into the evening. The hall lights clicked on in a soft line toward the elevator. I watched Tessa sign the suspension acknowledgement and the training plan and the first page of the restitution schedule. Her hand shook and then steadied. We stood. I told her to stay seated a little longer and listen to the list one more time, so it lives in her head tonight, and not only on paper. She nodded and stayed. We stepped into the hallway, and the door eased shut behind us. Sunday light fell kind on the brick of St. James, and the fellowship hall smelled like coffee and lemon oil. Folding chairs made careful rows and strands of white lights softened the edges of winter. Pastor Ruth greeted us at the door with that calm that makes people lower their shoulders without being told. She asked for patience and for ears that work harder than voices. I nodded and felt the room take one long, steady breath. Neighbors came in with coats draped over arms and that look people wear when headlines have visited their block. Margaret chose a seat near the front. Lawrence sat beside her with his hands folded. Drew stood for a while at the back wall and then took a place 2 rows in as if to say he would not hide and would not perform either. Natalie set a small table by the door with handouts in plain words. Maya kept the sign in sheet neat. Eleanor and Ethan took side chairs where they could help without pulling the focus. Pastor Ruth opened with a simple prayer that sounded like a shared breath, and then she asked me to explain our plan. I kept it clean. Jobs would begin here, and we would hire people who live here first. Families who must move would receive real help and not a stack of numbers that do not answer. There would be a phone line and an email that goes to a person with a name. Monthly check-ins in this very room until the last promise is met. Ethan would meet anyone who wanted a closer look at flood maps after we finished today. I said the words, and then I sat so the room could answer back. A man in a denim jacket asked about storm tides and narrow streets. Ethan stood and spoke the way teachers speak when they respect the class. He traced water paths on a large print and pointed to the places we would lift and the places we would leave open. He promised printed maps and digital copies without hoops. Heads tilted. Fear did not vanish, but it had less room to run. Pastor Ruth turned her eyes to where Tessa sat near the aisle with a folded tissue between her fingers. Tessa rose and came forward. She stood with her shoulders small and her voice smaller. She said she had shared materials that were meant for a limited circle. She said she had thought she was helping her cousin look strong. She said she had not understood how quickly a small link becomes a story with a life of its own. She said she was sorry. The silence that followed did not bite. It was held. I stood with her. I told the room that our process would continue. An arbitration would be scheduled after the holiday office reopened. Ethics training would be completed, and restitution would be paid according to the contract. The door back to ordinary work would remain open if she did what she had promised, and if she stayed with the work when the news moved on. We would not run a circus. We would handle this like adults and keep our eyes on repair. A woman near the front asked who would answer the phone at dinner time when parents finally have a minute to call. Natalie raised a hand and said, "A person would answer, and if a call was missed, a return call would go out that night or first thing next morning, and every call would be logged in a book anyone here could ask to see." Another neighbor asked about a mural on a cinder block wall that had kept watch over that block longer than some of us had been alive. I said we would protect it if we could and rebuild it with the artist if we must. We wrote the name of the artist and the block in the corner of a page. Then Margaret stood. She did not ask for the microphone, and she did not dress her words. She said fear of what people might say had made her small. She said she had guarded an image of our family and in doing so had failed to guard the people in it. She said she had measured worth by how quiet the whispers stayed and had let that measure decide too many things. She looked at me and at Drew, and then at the room, and said she wanted to spend what years she had left on work that stands up when someone steps close. Her voice did not shake. She finished and sat, and pressed her hands flat on her skirt like a woman setting an intention. The air changed by a degree you could feel on your face. Someone clapped once and then again, and the sound spread in small bursts that did not need to be loud to be true. The retired teacher from the last meeting asked for the oversight schedule. I handed her a page and she said she would bring cookies to the first session because sugar has a way of keeping tempers low. A father in a work jacket asked about apprenticeship spots for his son. Natalie wrote his name and number and said she would call on Tuesday afternoon. Pastor Ruth thanked the room for speaking like neighbors and asked if there were any last questions that would help people sleep. A young mother asked about move dates and notice. Maya answered that no one would be surprised by a truck on their street and that we would post a calendar on the church board and keep it updated. Eleanor added one careful sentence about rights of entry translated into home language and not legal form. No one seemed confused. No one seemed rushed. We ended with a short prayer for steady work and steady tempers. People stood in small circles, and the scrape of chair legs sounded like a town getting ready to try again. Tessa stayed near the front, and a few women reached for her hand and told her to keep going. Drew said he would drive her to see Margaret in an hour to tell the whole story and the whole plan. I folded the extra handouts and slid them into a box for the next room and the next conversation. The lights looked warmer on the way out than they had when we arrived. The door swung open to clean winter air. It felt like a beginning instead of a defense. Monday began with clean winter light and a room that felt ready for work. We gathered early at Langridge Tower and laid our pieces on the table as if we were setting out tools before a long repair. I wrote a first line in blue ink to keep my head steady. Keep it simple. Keep it honest. Keep it clear. Natalie took the lead on what the room would see. She rolled out a set of boards that looked like windows instead of walls. One page for jobs and training with a plain path from application to paycheck. One page for relocation support that described what help means in real life and not in brochure language. One page for a calendar a parent could stick on a refrigerator and actually use. She spoke as she moved steady and practical, and asked for a test question from me and another from Eleanor to catch any word that might wobble. Ethan stood by the big screen and gave our numbers a face neighbors could read without a guide. He turned tables into charts with colors that felt like a weather report. The flood maps showed how water wants to move, and the places where we would lift what cannot be left low. He added a small legend in plain English and a note that anyone who asked could have a printed map or a digital copy without hoops. He looked at me, and I nodded, because this is how I want the project to feel. Maya worked the lanes that make public meetings smooth. She called the clerk to confirm the order of the docket and checked the speaker list. She made sure we had extra pens and a sign-in sheet that did not turn into a traffic jam. She taped a schedule by the door and another near the elevator so no one asked what was next when nerves rose. Eleanor reviewed each page we planned to hand out and trimmed a sentence when the spine of the idea was strong enough to stand without decoration. At the door of our conference room, we placed a poster on an easel. The headline read, "Commitment to the Neighborhood" in large, calm letters. Under it sat 4 lines a person could carry in their head without a brochure. Jobs for local workers. Fair relocation helps. Respect for water and streets. Monthly open meetings until the last promise is kept. People from other floors paused, read and walked on with a look that said they understood. We built the oversight plan in the middle of the table. A committee of neighbors with names and phone numbers and seats that rotate. A monthly forum at St. James where questions can be asked and answered without microphones swallowing the human parts. A simple way to send a concern and a promise to reply within a day. Eleanor shaped the language so it fit on one page without losing its back. Responsibility and transparency and follow through with a small square beside each line to mark done. Drew came in on time and was quiet. He took the handouts and read them line by line. He asked Natalie how the phone would be staffed after dinner, when the day's work leaves people tired, but finally free to call. He asked Ethan how an older neighbor who does not love screens could see a large map without feeling small. He said he would be present for questions about the past, and he would keep his answers short. For once he stood beside the plan and did not try to stand on it. We rehearsed without theater. I would open and sit. Natalie would show the visuals and sit. Ethan would answer specific questions and sit. Eleanor would step in only when a piece of law needed a front porch translation. Maya would manage handouts at the back so no one waited with an empty hand. Drew would answer for the loan and for the plan to keep us honest now. If any of us slid into a speech, we would stop and return to the question. By midweek, the room looked like a small civic library. Binders labeled by subject. Maps rolled and tied with soft string. A box of handouts near the door and a second box by the far wall. Natalie pinned a checklist where everyone could see it and drew a small square next to each task. Ethan printed the flood charts in large format for the back row at the hearing. Maya set reminders on our phones so we arrived as rested as the calendar allowed. In the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a note from the planning office. Harold Kim sent the staff report draft. The recommendation was approved with conditions. Oversight committee with rotating seats. Monthly reporting posted for public review. Flood mitigation verified by an independent engineer. Coordination with transit, so a narrow street does not choke at rush hour. I read it twice and felt the room rise by a quiet inch. We took his list apart and put it back together with our names on each line. Ethan called an outside engineer to confirm the verification letter would be ready by the hearing date. Natalie trimmed a slide that tried to say too much and made it speak like a friend. Maya wrote a short thank you to staff for the clarity of their draft. Eleanor circled 2 clauses that needed a cleaner sentence and fixed them in pencil first and then ink. Drew volunteered to help set up chairs early on the morning of the hearing, and no one laughed because he meant it. The evening found us still at the table. The poster at the door stood straight. The clicker had fresh batteries. The water glasses were lined like neat thoughts. I stood at the window and watched the river keep the last light. The city looked like a patient teacher. It was ready to listen if we showed our work. The night manager dimmed the overheads and the room softened. We closed our folders and zipped our bags. Tomorrow will be a long day in a small room. We were ready to sit down to listen until we understood and to speak only what we were prepared to keep. Morning came bright and clean, as if the city had put on a new shirt after the holiday. We reached Langridge Tower early, and the quiet halls made our footsteps sound like focus. The conference table held neat stacks from last week and fresh coffee that smelled like resolve. I wrote a single line in blue ink and underlined it once. Begin. Half an hour into the day, Maya looked up from her screen and said there was a flag in the pilot pipeline. A file had landed in a hold at identity verification. The bank representative sounded careful and unwilling to move without a match on every field that mattered. The window for signatures was narrow, and the clock did not care that our city was still half asleep from Christmas. Natalie slid her white blazer into place and stood. She said she would take points. She asked Maya for the intake packet and a copy of every ID we had on file. She asked Ethan to confirm the correct address against public records, in case an old apartment number had followed the client like a stubborn shadow. She told Drew to pull up the old process map and mark any step where a mismatch could slip in without a human noticing. She did not ask to be believed. She gave everyone a job and turned the room toward the problem. We moved to the smaller conference room where the light catches the church spires. Natalie asked the bank to join a short video call so we could see the same fields at the same time and stop guessing. The bank manager appeared with the polite caution of a person who measures days by what gets signed and what does not. The escrow officer joined with the weary kindness of someone who has seen months collapse over a missing initial. Natalie introduced each of us without fuss and framed the issue in clean words. A middle initial appeared in some places and not others. The client had recently moved, and one system still held the old address. She said we would correct both on the call and provide clear proofs within the hour. The bank manager asked what would keep this from happening again. Natalie said we had already put in a 2-layer check that required a human to verify any change in name or address, and that until it had a month of clean outcomes, she would personally review every file marked pilot. She did not reach for charm. She offered a plan and stood in it. Maya slid a folder across the table with a fresh lease page and a current utility bill. Ethan lifted a 1-page confirmation from the city database that matched the unit number. Natalie asked the client to join for a minute by phone to present a clear picture ID to the camera and to confirm the full spelling of the middle name. The client appeared with an apologetic smile and steadier hands than most. The bank manager gave a secure email for a high-resolution copy. Natalie repeated it to avoid a typo and watched for the green light that says a system has finally received what it needs. Silence laid itself over the table. I counted breaths and reminded myself that waiting is part of the job when you choose daylight over shortcuts. Drew kept his eyes on the process map and drew 2 small circles where an error could slip through if a tired person trusted a screen too much. Natalie rested her palms on the table and watched the cursor blink on the bank side. The escrow officer looked down and then up. She said the file now matched on every line. The bank manager said he would mark verification complete as soon as he logged the documents and that the closing could proceed. Natalie thanked them for careful work and closed the call without trying to stretch relief into a speech. We returned to the larger room with the peculiar lightness that follows a simple win. An email arrived a minute later with the words, "Every room hopes for on the first day back. Approved to proceed." The subject line felt like a door opening quietly. I read it once and let my shoulders ease. Maya updated the tracker. Ethan archived the address proof with a label that would make sense to any person a year from now. Eleanor wrote a short note to file that recorded what had happened and what had changed to keep it from happening again. Natalie stood at the end of the table and reviewed the new steps out loud so the team could hear the cadence. A human eyes check for any change to names or addresses. A recorded confirmation call if a record disagrees with reality. A final end-of-day verification that catches strays before a clock makes them expensive. She owned each line with the kind of calm that leaves no room for argument. Drew spoke in the room for the first time since the call. He said his sister had just saved a deal he had almost put at risk, and that he was grateful for someone who could turn a bad moment into a better process. He said it without looking for applause. The words landed clean and stayed where he put them. I watched Natalie absorb them the way a strong person absorbs sunlight. She nodded once and said the team had given her ground to stand on. We walked the timeline forward to be sure the closing would not slip. Maya pinged the client with a checklist written in plain language, so the last steps would not trip over a technical phrase. Ethan printed a quick guide for staff who might need to walk another nervous client through a similar call. Eleanor drafted a template entry so future notes would look the same and carry the same clarity. The room felt like a shop where tools are kept where you reach for them. I stood by the window and let the winter light warm my face. Down on the street, a delivery truck paused and then moved on. The city kept going without knowing what had happened 2 floors up. That felt right. Not every win needs a witness. Some wins ask only that you do them right, and then write down how you did them. By noon, the file was closed, and the pilot had its first clean day of the year. Drew put the old process map back on the wall with 2 neat marks where we had tightened it. Natalie sent a short note to the bank team acknowledging their patience and promising the new checks were live. Maya set a reminder to review outcomes at the end of the week. I took a picture in my mind of a brother honoring his sister in a room that used to turn him into a show. I put it with the moments I keep to prove to myself that change is not a speech. It is a person in a white blazer standing up when the file blinks red and choosing steady over noise. Afternoon light lay flat across the long table and made the paper look cleaner than paper usually looks. The building held an after-holiday hush that lets decisions arrive without pushing. Eleanor opened her briefcase and set a neat stack in front of me and another where my father would sit. She placed a black pen between us like a compass and waited for the room to find its bearings. Lawrence came in with the careful pace of a man who has decided what he will do. He carried a worn leather folder that I recognized by the rubbed corner. He set it before me and rested his palm on it for a breath. Inside were my old proposals, the ones I had written in younger years, and left on his desk as if words could lift a house by themselves. His eyes held a sadness that did not argue with relief. He slid the folder toward me and took his seat. Margaret followed with that composed grace she keeps for Sundays and hard days. Drew stepped in last and chose the chair to my left. He looked at the documents and then at the window and then back at the documents as if his eyes needed time to catch up to his spine. Natalie stood near the credenza with the board candidate cards stacked and ready. Maya checked the calendar invite on the screen and sat where she could reach the scanner without crossing anyone's thoughts. Eleanor began in her steady kitchen table voice. She laid out what the restatement would do. The Cole Heritage Trust would be governed by an independent board. Seats would rotate. Votes would count. Family would be eligible only on the same terms as anyone else. Roles would rest on performance that could be shown and not on names that once opened doors. She pointed to the places where safeguards live and to the small squares where compliance would be marked. My father listened with his eyes on the page. He moved his lips a little in that old habit he has when he wants the words to slow down and be exact. He turned the pages and paused at the clause that removed automatic succession. He read it twice. He looked up at me and then down again. Eleanor did not rush him. The clock worked without hurrying anyone. He placed his fingertips on the signature line and held there long enough to feel the weight of the choice. Then the pen met the paper, and I heard the small scrape that has changed more lives than any speech. He signed the restatement that took blood out of the driver's seat and put merit behind the wheel. The room did not cheer. The light shifted a degree and my shoulders dropped a little, and that was enough. He turned the pen and set it by hand. He said with his eyes that he was sorry for years spent guarding an image instead of the people living under it. He said with the quiet in his face that he was grateful the years left could count for something better. No more needed saying. I pressed my palm to the worn folder and let myself accept what it meant to be seen and not managed. Margaret reached for the board cards and read the short notes Natalie had written about each candidate. She asked a single question about community work and nodded at the answer on the card. Then she said she would speak in public at the next neighborhood meeting and name the change. She would say that leadership sits with the person best equipped to lead and that this family would stop measuring worth by whispers. She would say thank you without making it a production. She folded her hands and looked lighter than I had seen her in years. Drew leaned forward until his elbows met his knees. He said he would enroll in the operations training and finish it without shortcuts. He would take the morning shifts no one loves and ask the questions that make a man humble. He would stand where the process lives and learn it until he had something sturdy to offer. He did not dress it as a vow. He said it as a plan, and he would check it off one clean morning at a time. I believed him because his posture matched his words. Natalie laid out the path to seat the independent board. A slate of candidates with histories that matched the work ahead. Terms long enough to build memory and short enough to keep air moving. Conflict standards plain enough to live by. She set the cards in a row so that each face had the same space on our table. Maya confirmed that notices were ready and that every recipient would receive the same packet at the same hour. She had letters addressed and a small stack of stamps that felt like dignity in a world that forgets how to send anything carefully. Eleanor guided us through signatures like a conductor keeps time. She paused at each place where an initial matters and looked up to be sure of the meaning, and ink held hands. Margaret signed without fuss. Drew added his acknowledgement of the training program and the conduct policy that now covered us all. Lawrence signed the last trustee action and placed the pen down with a small click that sounded like a door unbolting in an old house. He rose and walked to my side with a formality that belongs to older Charleston and to him. I stood and met him halfway. He opened his arms and I stepped in. We held the embrace long enough to make it real and then let it go before anyone had to look away. I told him in a voice kept level that choosing truth over pride is the kind of inheritance a daughter can use. He nodded once, a nod that reached back through years and across mistakes without pretending they did not happen. Margaret reached for my hand and squeezed it. She said she would call Pastor Ruth and ask for time on the next agenda. Natalie stacked the board cards and slipped a band around them. Maya gathered the executed pages and slid them into an envelope she had already labeled and time-stamped. Eleanor capped her pen and closed the folder with that quiet satisfaction she keeps for days when a plan becomes law. We sat for a moment and let the new rules find their places on our faces. Outside the river carried the color of late afternoon toward the sea. It looked like patience. I returned the old leather folder to my bag. The pages inside were not a wound anymore. They were a record of the road I had walked to get to this chair. We left the room without ceremony. The hallway lights felt warmer. Steps sounded less like echoes and more like intention. There was a hearing ahead where a city would decide whether our work deserved its trust. There were families who would judge us by the steadiness of our follow-through. For now, a father had chosen an order that could stand in daylight, and a family had agreed to live by it. That was enough for one clean page. The municipal chamber carried the smell of winter coats and paper when we took our seats. Every chair was filled. Neighbors lined the back wall with arms crossed more for warmth than judgment. The board arranged their binders and tested the microphones that make small breaths sound larger than they are. Harold Kim sat at the staff table with a binder that looked worked in. I held my card with 3 words written in block letters and felt my pulse slow to match them. I stepped to the podium and kept it spare. I named the commitments we had already placed in writing. Jobs that begin here for people who live here first. Relocation help that is human and reachable. A monthly open meeting at St. James with a real person at a real table. I addressed the fear that lives near water. Our plan lifts what must not sit low and honors the paths the river demands. I explained the oversight committee with rotating seats and a phone line that returns calls within a day. I sat before my voice could mistake confidence for volume. Natalie rose and moved through the visuals like a walk in even light. A page for local hiring with a plain trail from application to paycheck. A page for relocation that shows dollars and timing in terms a parent can carry in a head. A page for the calendar the neighborhood will see on its own board. She set the clicker down as if setting down a promise and returned to her chair. Ethan stood when a man in a ball cap asked what storm tide does to a narrow street that already holds its breath on heavy days. Ethan traced on a large print the way water wants to move, and where we would lift grades and where we would leave room for flow. He explained that an independent engineer would verify the mitigation before any shovel cut ground. He offered to meet by the maps afterward for anyone who wanted a closer look. He sat, and the room kept its calm. Questions came in an ordinary rhythm. A mother asked who answers at dinner time when hands are finally free to dial. Natalie said a person will answer and any missed call will be returned that night or first thing in the morning, and a log will sit in a book anyone can ask to see. A retired teacher asked about construction hours and how noise would respect school testing weeks. Maya noted the request and added it to the conditions we would accept without drama. Eleanor stepped in once to turn a clause about right of entry into a sentence a grandmother can take home and retell without fear. Harold rose with the staff report. He summarized the draft that had gone out. Approval, recommended with conditions. Oversight in public view with rotating seats. Monthly reporting posted and reviewed. Flood mitigation verified independently. Coordination with transit, so turn lanes keep narrow streets from choking at rush. He thanked the room for showing respect to a process that often has to earn it. The board closed questions and moved into their own quiet. One member asked for clarity on the schedule for the oversight committee. Another asked how grievances would be tracked and resolved without disappearing into email. We answered as rehearsed, and then let the silence work. There is respect in stepping back when a board thinks. Hands rose. The vote carried. Approved with conditions. The chair read them into the record. Committee formed with named contacts. Reports monthly. Flood mitigation verified. Transit coordination documented. The gavel touched wood. Air moved through my chest like a tide turning. The room answered with small claps that sounded like a street letting out a breath. In the hallway, neighbors came in twos and threes. A father handed Natalie a number on a folded receipt for his son who wanted the apprenticeship path. The retired teacher asked for the oversight dates and promised oatmeal cookies for the first meeting because sugar keeps tempers low. Drew stayed near and answered for the past without reaching for a stage. He said he was learning to be useful, and the words sounded less like a hope and more like a plan. On the steps outside, my phone buzzed with a message from the lender. Assignment complete. Records updated. Pinecrest had stepped out of the doorway. I sent it to Eleanor and Maya and watched the small check mark delivered. A second buzz followed with a link from the paper. Lydia Hart had published a long piece that read like a second look. She had spoken with neighbors from the church hall and had walked through our plan without heat. The newsroom pinned a correction to the earlier story on its homepage. It named the errors and set them straight without fireworks. I felt gratitude, and then I let it go so I could keep moving with my feet on the same ground that had just approved us. Back at the office, we sat for a short debrief. Eleanor confirmed that the arbitration filing sat on the docket and that we would hold it in place while Tessa completed her training and restitution. If she met every mark, we would withdraw the case and let the lesson carry the weight going forward. Tessa sent a short update from her phone. First module complete and volunteer hours scheduled at the neighborhood clinic. Drew read the note and said he would drive her tomorrow to meet the coordinator so she would not back out in the parking lot when the old shame tried to bite. Maya posted the board conditions on our wall and placed a small square next to each item for done. Ethan scheduled the independent engineer visit and set a reminder to invite neighbors to watch with their own eyes. Natalie updated the hotline schedule so the dinner time block had live coverage. The room had the hum of a shop where tools sit, where the hand expects to find them. As the sun thinned across the river, my phone lit again with my father's name. He wrote a single line that fit the new order we had signed. Family supper, mid-month. You choose the place. Margaret followed with a second note that read, like a smile in words. I tucked the phone away and looked at the team. We had been measured that day and found steady enough to proceed. The work would keep us honest. The city would hold us to our promises. The river would remind us to respect its path. We packed the binders and loosened our shoulders. Outside, the air had that clean edge a southern winter carries when it promises cold without cruelty. The streetlights came on in a quiet line. We walked toward the elevator with the relief that arrives when effort meets a fair process and neither tries to pretend it is something else. Indigo House held its warm light against the early dark, and the lobby smelled like cedar and citrus. The private room looked smaller than I remembered and kinder. The table was set in simple white and the candles hummed instead of flaring. I hung my navy coat on the stand and felt the steady weight of the blue dress remind my shoulders to drop. Drew arrived first and stood when I stepped in. The charcoal suit fit him with less shine and more purpose. Natalie followed with the white blazer that had become her uniform for plain answers. She set her phone face down and said she was off the clock even if the work was not done with us. A server placed a small envelope at my seat and said it had been delivered earlier. I slid it into my bag. Victor had sent congratulations and regrets and wished for a night that belonged only to family. Margaret entered with a careful smile and a red shawl folded over her arm. Lawrence came behind her with that old courtliness that holds the door and steadies a room without asking for thanks. We took our seats without ceremony. I did not wait to be invited to the head chair. I pulled it out and sat, and the linen felt cool under my hands. We ordered without fuss. Roast chicken and winter greens, spoon bread and potatoes with rosemary, coffee for later, and sweet tea for Margaret because the South holds its rituals. Conversation began with the easy things. Weather and church news, and the river looking high but honest. Then a quiet settled that asked for more than small talk. Margaret looked across the table at me. She said thank you in a voice she usually saves for prayers. It was a rare word from her in that direction, and it did not hide behind anything. She said she could see what steadiness looks like when it is done in daylight. The muscles in her jaw let go. The room shifted by a degree you feel rather than see. Natalie unlocked her screen and turned it for Margaret to read. She had a page of client notes from the pilot week. Names and simple lines of relief. Fast callbacks. Clear steps. Respect that feels like a door that opens the first time you touch it. Margaret read slowly, and the corners of her mouth lifted the way they used to when we were small, and brought home a paper with a star drawn in red. She asked Natalie to save the page for her, and the smile traveled around the table like a small light. Drew cleared his throat and kept his eyes on the center, where the candles burned low. He said he would finish the operations training without shortcuts. He said he wanted responsibility that grows from work and not from the last name on a letterhead. He did not look to me for rescue or to Margaret for praise. He let the words land and did not reach to pick them back up. Lawrence nodded and let out a breath that sounded like a door easing open in a house that had been shut too long. Plates came and went, and the ordinary work of passing dishes did what it always does. It reminded us that families survive on small courtesies more than on speeches. The server refilled water and brought the envelope I had set aside in case I had changed my mind. I did not open it. The message was already known. Victor would not attend. He wanted the evening to belong to us and only us. After the plates were cleared, Margaret stood. She unfolded the red shawl and came to my chair. Her hands did not shake. She laid the wool across my shoulders with the care of a nurse tending a quiet wound. It was an apology without pageantry, and it landed in the place where the old hurt had once lived. I held her forearm a moment and let the softness of the fabric and the weight of the gesture do the work words would have spoiled. Lawrence lifted his water glass not for a toast, more for a pause. He said he had read the new board packet and liked that decisions would sit in a room with windows. He said he had slept well for the first time in months. He set the glass down with that small care he gives to objects that outlast us. I felt the room accept the idea that order and affection can share a table. We shared pecan pie and small coffees that steamed like winter breath. Natalie and Margaret talked about dresses for the next community meeting and laughed at a small joke that needed no retelling. Drew asked if he could bring a colleague from training to the next supper so he could learn how we listen. Lawrence said there would be room, and I heard the truth in it. I looked at each face and let the moment print itself in the part of me that keeps proof. Natalie with a faint flour smudge on her cuff from a cookie stolen in the lobby. Drew with a crease at his elbow where he had been leaning into the work. Margaret with her pearls set just so and a gaze unguarded at last. Lawrence with his posture lighter by years. The red shawl was warm at the back of my neck. I thought of Christmas Eve and a doorway and an instruction to wait in the car. The old bruise rose and then released. In this house, justice would not be a spectacle. It would be order and responsibility and compassion with edges that keep everyone honest. When the bill came, I covered it and no one argued. We stood together and put on our coats. At the door, Margaret adjusted the shawl as if to make sure it would not slip. Drew held the door and did not flinch when I walked through first. Natalie slipped her arm through mine and laughed at something small and ordinary and perfect. The street smelled like night rain and river. Charleston held its quiet, and the city looked like a promise kept. If this story made you believe that kindness and boundaries can live in the same room, share it with someone who needs a steady ending, leave a comment with the moment that stayed with you, and stay with us for more journeys where families choose truth over pride.